Hello, my name is Magali Picard. I am the National Executive Vice President of the PSAC. We're looking forward to welcoming you into the Public Service Alliance of Canada when deeming takes place later this year. You'll join more than 200,000 workers across the country, and through the power of our bargaining, we'll work to improve your working conditions. I know many of you have questions about how the deeming will work, so I hope this webinar answers many of them. Our door is always open, so please reach out to us whenever you have a question or a concern. I'm looking forward to work with you all very soon.
All right, so we'll continue on here, moving into our presentation. Before we do that, I'll invite Stan and Omar to introduce themselves.
Hi there, I'm Stan Stapleton. I'm National President of the Union of Safety and Justice Employees. I'm elected for 3-year terms at our triannual convention, and that convention is coming up in July this year for USJE. My substantive position is in corrections, where I've worked since 1980. Omar.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Omar Bergan. I am a research officer at PSAC. I've been I'm a former public servant once upon a time, and I do research in the negotiations department, and I'm assigned to the PA table where many of you are being deemed.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Lauren. So as we move forward, what are some of the advantages of union membership and belonging to a member? And certainly we are all familiar with the negotiation of terms and conditions of work and our collective agreement, and that is what many members see as what the union does. However, we do many more things, and within the local, it creates a stronger voice in the workplace, which benefits all the members. The local representatives, be they shop stewards, local presidents, have the ability to negotiate and discuss with senior managers in your workplace and resolve problems fairly quickly. You get to participate in the union directly. It is a democratic organization, so representatives are elected, and both at a local and at the National Triannual Convention, which, as I mentioned earlier, happens this summer. You can also participate in union training. We have many other activities that happen, some social, others are mobilization activities, such as engaging your member of parliament in issues that impact your workplace, and we certainly provide assistance in those discussions, and a variety of other things. And we do have a voice in Canada's labor movement. We have seats, delegates at the the CLC, Canadian Labor Congress. And as well, through all of these things, we are able to improve the dignity and the respect in the workplace. And your local is just a very basic the basic part, actually the foundation of the organization of our union in particular. The local volunteers that run for president and other positions, they're the ones that you have direct contact with every day. USJE is one of 15 components of the PSAC, and USJE represents members on specific labor relations questions within the workplace. So if there's problems in the workplace, it'll normally be your local, but that information will all come forward to the national office, and if necessary, the national office and myself will intervene. And your bargaining agent for collective agreements is the Public Service Alliance of Canada. And I talked a little bit earlier about your local having a day-to-day contact with you. You certainly, as you get involved, can become a local president, union officer, or a shop steward. Certainly, I learned a tremendous amount as a shop steward. When you're a shop steward, you really get to know your collective agreement, and that is really very important. So you ensure that your managers and others do not trample on your rights that are established within the collective agreement. So engaging, becoming a shop steward, or moving to the higher levels is really a very good learning experience, and actually can help you in your career within the public service, because while you're doing that work, you're also learning different policies and practices and guidelines of the employer that the employer is required to follow. You can also join different committees that will help with member engagement. For example, one of our large locals in Ottawa with the RCMP, they have put on a couple movie nights, and members are invited to come out to those nights with their families. It's I don't believe they charge anything. If they do, it's a minimal cost, and you learn a little bit, but you have a good time. You meet some of your colleagues at work that you may not otherwise meet. And the general meetings are where union business is conducted. It's very important that you join, attend general membership meetings, because decisions are made there, and the direction that the local wants to go, either in management engagement or in engaging members of parliament, or of course back to the social events, but also through the local membership and local meetings is where you have the ability to provide input when PSAC is asking for input for demands for the upcoming collective agreement, or our National Joint Council, that they do cyclical reviews of the issues and rights that are discussed and negotiated there. And so you become aware by attending the meetings, but you also have input. And yeah, all I can say is you really should become involved and engaged, and it helps not only you, but it also helps your colleague. We, Union Safety and Justice employees, represent over 16,000 members now, and we are in 18 different government departments. I'm not going to read them all to you, but they certainly include corrections, RCMP, justice, CSIS, Pro Board of Canada. All of them fall either under the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General, or under the Ministry of Public Safety. Sorry, my pages kind of got mixed up here. And of course, PSAC is responsible for bargaining, and Omar will talk about that a little later in the webinar. As I mentioned, union governance, the local elections are held annually at general meetings, and also that's where you will be electing delegates to the triennial convention. And so you don't necessarily have to hold office to be a delegate, although it certainly helps. But the triennial convention is the governing body of our union. In between conventions, it's the national executive. But at the triennial convention, that's where the delegates that attend get to set the direction of the union for the next 3 years. And of course, the delegates are bringing their information and the feedback from the locals. The PSAC leadership are also elected at regional and national triennial conventions, and regional triennial conventions will be happening this spring. And so regional executive vice presidents will be elected this spring. And then, of course, you have the National Board of Directors and the Alliance Executive Committee. And National Board of Directors is made up of the Alliance Executive Committee and component presidents. And they are the governing body in between PSAC conventions. Also at the PSAC convention, you will also turn national triennial. That's where we elect the PSAC national president and the PSAC national executive vice president. As civilian members, you will be integrated into existing locals. I can tell you though that at the national office, I will be appointing labor relations officer to help oversee the issues that civilian members will be bringing forward when they first join USJE. So even though you'll be attached to a local, there will be an ability to reach into our national office to ask questions and understand how your terms and conditions of employment have changed from when you were a civilian member. We have many experienced and skilled labor relations officers. We have presently we have 5 at the national office, and we have a director of labor relations as well. We also have a finance department, and we have a policy, projects, and media relations department that assists in the engagement with members of parliament. And should you choose to go visit a member of parliament, that is who you would contact, and we would give you some advice. We provide you with some speaker's notes and that to speak to the members of parliament, because some members of parliament, actually parliament, that are our ultimate bosses. So you'll certainly benefit from coming in to the existing structure. So there's no organizational challenges that you would have if you came in cold. And as we move towards deeming, we have had a website up, USJE, since I believe 2014 to engage, and PSAC has also a website up with regards to, or information on their website with regards to the deeming process. And you can certainly go to the PSAC website or the USJE website if you want more information, or if you have questions. I would recommend you go there first, because we have frequently asked question pages, and they may be able to answer all your questions. As far as the bargaining strategy update and why PIPS and CAPE have agreements and we don't, I will leave that to Omar to talk about. We are moving forward. We had a discussion with Treasury Board yesterday and last week. They're giving us updates on the Phoenix pay system and how that transition, or the preparations for a transition, are going. And right now they're fairly positive, but we still, of course, have concerns, as do all the unions, with regards to moving over to the Phoenix pay system. We're making connections with civilian members across the country. We have been for a while now. And we have a number of people that we have been in regular contact, and that we brought to some meetings in Ottawa. We want to expand the information, the contact information we have with civilian members, so we can broaden that and make the selection of civilian members that are going to start attending on your behalf, make it more democratic. And for that purpose, we will be asking for your personal email addresses, not your work email addresses, because we really don't want to put things on the employer's network, because they're subject to access to information requests, whereas your personal email is not, and our union email is also not. We did organize a training session for some civilian members in Ottawa in January 2018. We brought in the regional vice presidents, as well as PSAC had presenters. We had presenters so that they could understand better. And I have traveled across the country attending some of these meetings, and some of those representatives have attended these meetings and spoken to the civilian members. So on that note, I will hand it over to Omar to talk about collective bargaining and such.
Thank you, Stan. So the picture you see right now is the negotiator for the PA group, Ms. Gail Lem, who I have the privilege of working with at the bargaining table. And I had also produced a video for Francophone members. So I'll just, since I'm here in person, I'll give you a rundown of kind of what the bargaining process is, since it might be very new for a lot of you. So essentially what happens is that when you're part of a collective agreement, for those of you who've never been in a unionized work environment, or unionized at least in the public service, all your benefits and all the basically your work conditions are contained in your collective agreement, and it's an agreement that typically lasts between 3 and 4 years. And when it gets close to coming up for when it's about to expire, basically the PSAC starts putting out what's called the bargaining input. which is essentially we ask all of our members. So there's, depending on the agreement, they're under PA specifically is 85,000 members. It's the largest bargaining table in Canada. We put out this input saying, okay, everyone, agreement's coming up. It's going to expire. What do you want to see happen here? What are the challenges in your workplace? What do you think you deserve as a worker as part of this group? And so this goes out through the components into the locals, and then we hear back from members. So they submit things, and it's it can be anything from basically, I compared us. I took a look at what my friends who work in the provincial government get for vacation. We get less than them. I don't think that's fair. That's really not enough vacation, for work-life balance. Or, I really feel like my work is not compensated appropriately. We should get a premium for this very specific thing that we do that perhaps other people get as well. Or it varies, and it can also be like a human rights issue. For example, some members might say, discrimination is rampant in our workplace, and the language in our agreement's good, but it really doesn't say this strong enough. And because of that, we encountered some situations where we didn't find it was adequate protection. We really think the agreement should clearly state that the employer cannot do this to us. So it's all sorts of stuff when we get hundreds and hundreds of pieces of input, and it gets put into a document. It's the input call, basically binder, and we have a bargaining conference that takes place. Again, this all happens months and months before the expiry of the collective agreement, because we get everything set up before we start to bargain. At the conference, we discuss, members come and discuss all the things that were submitted. There's all sorts of workshops. We discuss bargaining. There are actually, for at the beginning of 2018, when we had the last bargaining conference, I know that there was also a group of CMs that was invited to attend. And that's also where we elect the bargaining team. So, bargaining, as Stan mentioned, unions are kind of obsessed with democracy, which is a great thing. But basically, all decisions that are made at our bargaining table, although staff gives advice, you have your peers basically get elected to be at the bargaining table and represent your interests and represent them in front of the employer and report back to you. So we elect the bargaining team, and once the bargaining team is elected, then we have a lot of preliminary meetings to finalize basically, hey, what are we going to, we can't ask, the things we receive from members, it can number, in the hundreds of demands. And although we would like to have every single one, sometimes we do have to prioritize, and the bargaining team helps make those difficult, sometimes difficult decisions, but basically helps us identify how we can really get the most achievable things, get the things members deserve the most, and make certain things priority to prepare a strategy for bargaining. So we present this to the employer, and essentially the employer, can basically take as much time as they want. It sometimes is very frustrating. We sometimes get a few things they say okay to, but oftentimes they hold out and they say, listen, you guys already have it good enough, just be happy with what you have. And sometimes we do get agreements with the employer before we reach what's called impasse, but often we don't, because that's just the way bargaining happens often, regardless of what union you're a part of. So that's when you reach something called impasse. And impasse is basically where the two parties are like, where the employer says, this is all we're going to give you, and where the union says, this is not acceptable in any way for us to have as the next 3-year contract. We're missing this and this, and you're asking us to give up this and this. That's not acceptable. And currently at all the tables, that's where we're at. We're at something which is called impasse, where basically we file for impasse. It's a legal a mechanism that exists under the Labor Code, and we go to what's called under the federal public servant legislation. We go to what's called a Public Interest Commission, which we just completed. Essentially, it's where you have to submit every single thing that you still did not resolve, and you have to provide as much rationale as possible, and you have to discuss it in front of an arbiter who's an impartial body, and within 30 days, the arbiter has to give out a report. Now, this all sounds, as convincing as a lot of our arguments are, and even if the arbiter agrees with 90% of them, the frustrating part of this this process is it is a non-binding report. So the employer can still look at it and say, yeah, the arbiter thinks you need more vacation, but too bad, so sad, we're not going to give it to you. But also it could help unblock things, and you can get back to the table, and it can serve to get a tentative agreement, which is what we always hope for. We always want to get a deal for members as quick as possible, but it has to be a fair deal. Now, if the party still after that cannot get to an agreement, and the employer holds back still, and your bargaining team is not satisfied, that's the first time that you are allowed under the law to have a strike vote. So that's when you have a vote basically across Canada in our situation to have a vote for a strike, and then commence strike action to put pressure on the employer. You know, but a lot of things can happen in between, obviously. You know, I've often people say that the best way to avoid a strike is to be well prepared for one, because just by the sheer power of numbers of our bargaining team, we command, you know, a lot of labor power, in the sense that when we withdraw our labor, it can really hit the employer hard, and often the employer will say, okay, don't do that strike vote thing, let's talk. And that can launch things again. So in a nutshell, that's the bargaining process, and that is kind of the summary of what was in the video. So I will ask Lauren, if you're still there, if you can move on. Thank you. So let's see what it says here. So that's what I discussed. If we can't reach a deal after the PIC report, that's when we can go for the strike vote. So I'll go to the next slide. So again, that discusses the, that's the line. I knew I didn't take it from anywhere. The best way to avoid a strike is to prepare for one. You know, and we do have a lot, our regional office staff often does a lot of mobilizing with the locals. Mobilizing is basically the term for getting employees to get, you know, to speak up, to either lobby their MPs, put up posters in the workplace saying, you know, we work so hard, treat us fairly, that's all we ask. Wearing bracelets, wearing buttons. These are the kind of mobilization activities, and again, because, you know, it's thousands and thousands of members, you know, I cannot understate how, you know, when it's just a few people in some hotel room in Ottawa just talking to the employer, they have it's easier for them to say no to us. But when they start noticing that thousands of people are saying, you know, don't you think you guys should just settle across the country, that can have a tremendous amount of power, and often it's the way we have turned things around. So why do PIPs and CAPE have collective agreements and we don't? That's a very good question. So the way bargaining happens, it's not, you know, we don't sign off automatically on what other unions agree to. Every union is separate. They have, you know, totally free range to sign up any agreement they want to, and we don't necessarily get the exact same agreements they do. First of all, because our members are different membership. If you look at PIPs and CAPE, they represent a lot of scientific staff, you know, different policy analyst staff. So their demands and their asks won't be the exact same as ours. Furthermore, PSAC has different values and priorities, and often that comes to us from our membership itself. And there's certain things that we will push back on way harder and have the power to push back on way better than smaller unions might, and we won't hold back on doing that. I'll give you one example. In the last round, Treasury Board was pushing really hard to get rid of our sick leave. So sick leave in the core public service is quite good. It's probably it can't be as good as civilian members of the RCMP, because you folks have probably something that is, you know, really exceptional. However, it is a decent sick leave, and it serves our members well. And although it might not be perfect in some regards, the employer wanted to replace it with something that we deem to be absolutely unacceptable, which is a private short-term disability plan, which is basically a private insurance company for when you're sick. So you have to, you know, file an insurance claim. The insurance company calls you up. Essentially, it was something that we deemed to be completely unacceptable for our memberships, and the employer wasn't moving on that. So we pushed back really hard, and even though the smaller unions all accepted it, we didn't, and we maintained our sick leave plan. And that's something we're not afraid to do in circumstances where it merited. So, in the current circumstance, if I'm going to speak about just generally what's happening at the PA table, again, Treasury Board is trying to push something that we don't think is acceptable. They want our members to accept slightly less than inflation, which basically causes them to have a reduction in wage, and they're making any attainment of just having cost of living or inflation increases. They want to deduct any small things we got for smaller groups from that, so the majority of members get less than inflation, which is something we can't accept. In terms of bargaining the deeming letter, that is tied into this current round of negotiations, and PSAC believes very firmly that we will fight to ensure that members of the RCMP who are deemed maintain the absolute best working conditions that they can get. And we've let that be known to the government, and PSAC actually received a letter from the former president of Treasury Board, Scott Bryson, guaranteeing us that members who are deemed, even if we haven't come to agreement, that they won't, that their current working conditions will be frozen until such time that we achieve it. And we're holding that letter, and saying, this is what we were guaranteed, and we don't want to start making exceptions. What ends up happening at the table, as my colleagues mentioned earlier, is that currently we are discussing it. There's still a back and forth happening, and basically the general premise is we're telling them that if there are certain things we can agree on with Treasury Board, we're happy to agree on them. However, there's any of your working conditions that we don't come to agreement on, you can't go to strike over it. So we're insisting that these specific matters be sent to binding arbitration, so that if, let's say, they say they should get vacation that's this much, and we say no, their vacation has to be this much as per what they used to have, and we just can't agree. Our default is like, well, look, if we come to that point, this has to be sent to arbitration, and an arbiter, or like basically a labor judge, has to make the call, because we can't pressure you with a strike. So we want essentially to have a mechanism where that'll be decided, so members aren't left in limbo being like, are we going to get it? We're not going to get it. I thought we signed something, but they're not giving it to us. We basically want to make that crystal clear to the employer that we'll agree to anything that there's no debate over, but anything that we don't see eye to eye, we want sent to arbitration, and that is PSAC's position, and we're not afraid to hold the government to that, and to push hard against any kind of second-rate agreement that they might be offering us. Recommending that you get to know your local leadership, know what locals that you're and what stay informed of what your union can do for you, and take a look at the collective agreements. On that point, because it's talking about collective agreements, I will say that part of the work the negotiations department did is doing a good review of basically what your current conditions are, and so we're very aware of where your work conditions are superior to the collective agreements you're being deemed into, and this is basically the central theme of the agreements that we're trying to reach with Treasury Board with regards to deeming. Stan, did you want to add anything to that?
Just with regards to reaching out to the local executive, many local executives have themselves been reaching out to civilian members and trying to gather information. Please feel free to talk to them. Unfortunately, we are not in a real position to provide full representation to civilian members until you're deemed. That may change. I don't think so, but it may change. So I'm just reaching out, getting advice from your local executive or your local shop steward to understand what the new collective agreement will look like will likely be very helpful in the future. And I guess we'll pass it off to Lauren.
Right. So thank you both for that content. I think hopefully the participants will benefit immensely from that information. We do have a few questions that came in throughout the webinar, and so I'll lead you through those. And if others have questions you want to ask, then please just type them in, or you can, again, use the hand icon and I can come to you later. So someone was asking if this is recorded. Yes, as I indicated in the chat function. So this will be recorded and posted on USJE website under the civilian members page. I think if I remember correctly, there we go. That information is available to you right there. So the first question, PIPS and CAPE have already said what their members will get in regards to sick leave benefits and leave, etc. I've been a CM with the RCMP since 2000 and have no idea what we are getting. Will we be guaranteed to a minimum of CAPE and what other unions have? So maybe Omar, you can tackle that one.
So the question is, will we be guaranteed a minimum of at least what they got?
Yeah.
I think, you know, in any situation, obviously, we will pay close attention to what the members, you know, who are under PIPS and CAPE have gotten. And I don't think there would ever be a situation where we would say that you folks, you know, deserve less. I mean, when a smaller union signs beforehand, in some respects, it sets the bar, meaning that there's absolutely, the employer would be hard pressed to offer anything that is less than them. I mean, that's kind of, you know, that it sets a precedent already. So I think if there's any delay at the moment is because our negotiation staff wanted to ensure that any holes basically in the agreement that is offered to PIPS and CAPE are closed, that we don't have, that we have clear language that indicates above and beyond what PIPS and CAPE have signed. So, you know, I don't like to make, you know, overarching statements about yes, it will, but I mean, just given how negotiation works, the employer could never offer less, you know, saying, oh, we gave these unions this and you guys are about, you know, 10 times more, and but you're only going to get this. I think what's clear to us is that we have a responsibility to ensure that any oversight that might have occurred, that anything that we think the members deserve above and beyond the CAPE and PIPS agreements are addressed, and that there's no oversight or glaring omissions in any agreement. Like I said, the main issue I think is coming down to the details of your work standards, and ensuring that if ever there's a situation where, you know, some members come back and say, you know, they cut this or they cut that, or that's not what we agreed to, that we can take it to arbitration and the employer agrees that fine, it'll go to binding arbitration, and an arbiter will decide, and we will close any loophole that way. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. The next question is relatively detailed around some sick leave issues, but the gist of it really is, you know, what can we be expecting, the CMs be expecting in terms of sick leave from what they have to where they're going, that sort of thing.
So as I mentioned before, I think we're all well aware that CMs have a very unique situation when it comes to sick leave. As I said, you know, PSAC fought long and hard against you know, concessions to the federal public service sick leave plan already, just as recently as last round. This was under the previous government, but the current government just maintained the same mandate and was pushing really hard to get rid of it. So all that to say is that, you know, I honestly cannot give an answer on the specifics of what it will be, in so much to say that we won't accept something that is you know, a major concession for members. We will definitely try hard to you know, our utmost essentially to get the very best for members, because we're well aware that there's a disparity. I believe that, you know, unlimited sick leave, I don't know if there's anyone who has that current plan. Under the current public service collective agreements, it's not unlimited in the sense that you have a specific amount you get per years of service. However, there's no cap. So certain members by the end of their career have very large sick leave banks, which they never use. They retire, and it's kind of like it was like insurance for them in case they did get gravely ill and needed to take a lot of sick leave. So I think the plan for CMs, you know, we are arduously working, and those are kind of the discussions that are happening at the table, that we're ensuring that members of the RCMP have a very good and appropriate level of sick leave, and I think the negotiation staff will work very hard towards that.
Thanks, Omar. The next question is, it's kind of a technical one, and I'll maybe take it on. It's, why are we told that PSAC's application is still pending? This can be very confusing, and it gets into labor relations stuff with respect to the Public Service Labor Relations and Employment Board. There were different processes when we learned of the deeming and how to provide representation to members, given that deeming wasn't happening right away. Our approach was going to be one of trying to come to a mutual agreement with Treasury Board in terms of memorandum of agreement. Other unions went forward and submitted an application under the Labor Board to begin to provide that representation. When we did that, unfortunately, the Labor Board put our application into abeyance, which means that it just got stuck. So when you hear this thing about our application is pending, at this point, given that deeming is happening in May, it's kind of a moot point. We're continuing to do our work at the bargaining table. As Omar said, doing our research. We've done the research in terms of your current terms and conditions, and we're moving forward. So I hope that answers that question. When you hear that pending application, really it's a Labor Board issue. It's kind of not relevant at this point because deeming is imminent. The next question we have is about terms and conditions. What do you mean by terms and conditions? Are you not negotiating our terms and conditions? So yeah, maybe define terms and conditions, and then how does that relate to civilian members?
Okay, I'm not sure in what context I said terms and conditions. I think, well, essentially, there's two things, right? I mean, there's basically a collective agreement is a contract that is very explicit about your work benefits. You know, things that essentially, if your employer ever violated, for instance, didn't give you vacation when you qualified for it, didn't give you sick leave when you qualified for it, made you do something that the contract says you can't. These things all define your conditions. So there's that. And what needs to happen eventually is that the RCMP's working conditions have to be basically explicitly stated and captured somewhere, either in a letter that states that anything this and this that you used to have, you still get, or that you used to have this, now you get something else. So there's that. But what we're specifically negotiating at the table is basically an understanding of what is going to happen to all your working conditions, whether it's, you have basically specific assurances from your employer or benefits as to relocation, where you get relocated upon retirement, as to, I know that members have funeral benefits. Funeral benefits don't exist in these collective agreements that exist, in the federal public service, because it's not something that members before the RCMP had. So what happens with that is that we need to have it contained somewhere where it's official, that the employer can't just unilaterally take that away. So we're essentially discussing all your benefits, but also discussing with the employer, a mechanism, a letter that says, these are the CM members of the RCMP. They were deemed on such date. Their conditions were such and such on that day. From now going forward, they will be this much. And anything that we cannot find agreement on, we're sending to arbitration. So an arbiter will decide and make the final decision about. So that'll be everything from your, hopefully a lot of things will be, we'll come to an agreement with the employer, but anything that's left over that the employer says, absolutely not, no more, no one's getting any relocation benefits anymore. We say, okay, fine, we disagree, we're sending it to arbitration, the arbiter will decide.
I think the other thing I would add there, Omar, is some terms and conditions are negotiable and some aren't. Some are employer policies, right? Those are also, some employer policies are also considered terms and conditions of work. So there's the stuff that your bargaining agent negotiates, and then there's other terms and conditions that are outside of the scope of bargaining. Just to clarify what that term means. Does PSAC foresee going on strike before or after deeming?
So as I said a couple times, you know, it's the more I repeat it, it's not a cliche. It's true. Is that, you know, the best way to avoid a strike is to be well prepared for one. Is that PSAC cannot say, you know, we will or we won't. It's that a strike is basically a way to avoid or to move an employer towards you know, coming to a fair deal. It's putting basically a consequence to the employer being stubborn about things that we assert are not things that we're willing to accept. I think the message we send to the employer always is that our members, you know, are fed up. They deserve to be treated with respect. And after everything that's gone on with Phoenix and the absolute havoc it's reaped, you know, it's caused to people, is that if you keep going down this path, if you keep denying members, you know, basic things in the workplace that they're asking for, and you know, a wage that just keeps up with inflation. If you keep denying this, our members are going to start voting for strikes. So, you know, a strike is hard work. A strike is a sacrifice, but it's, you know, it's not something that we can say we foresee or we don't. It's that, you know, mobilizing and organizing for a strike and letting the employer know that, you know, hey, you guys are really stalling on basically a 0.5, you know, increase or a 1% increase that'll just keep us at inflation. We think this is unacceptable. If you want to be that stubborn about it, we're ready to strike, is basically the message we send to the employer. You know, we always hope that the employer will say, okay, fine, we'll just give that extra bit that makes you believe that your deal is fair, and then we don't have to go on a strike. But we always make it clear to the employer that we're not afraid to, if we feel like they're being very stubborn or basically treating the membership unfairly. So that's kind of the perspective on that.
Yeah, and it's not the quote unquote union that decides to go on strike, it's the membership via the strike vote, right? So it's a democratic process. If the Scott Bryson letter does not hold, what will happen at deeming in terms of terms and conditions of employment?
That's a good question. I think we're not there yet. I think, like I said, these discussions are happening. You know, whether it holds or not is you know, it's a written guarantee, and we're pushing, you know, to basically have that guarantee that we were made by this current government, and to have that contained in an appropriate letter that recognizes your previous work conditions. So what was the second part of the question, Lauren? Was it what will we do, or what will happen on the date of deeming?
Right. Will the terms and conditions be frozen if that letter's not acknowledged?
I mean, I think we would hope, we're letting the employer know that that's the only thing we'd accept, because that's the guarantee we were given. And you know, I don't want to speak out of turn, or because I don't really, I think that would be something that our legal department might have to handle, because we, you know, we hope it doesn't come to that point where they basically either downgrade certain of your conditions, or I mean, that's the situation we would fight against. You know, if we don't come to agreement and they downgrade certain of your conditions without us having gotten to agreement, I'm assuming the union would take certain measures to push back against that, and to uphold your conditions in that situation.
Right, and another option too is getting a memorandum of agreement signed off by the employer, which is an extension of that letter effectively, correct?
I mean, the letter itself, like we consider it to be quite, you know, it's not just some, you know, some staff at Treasury Board making that. It was essentially the president of Treasury Board. So we feel like it's a political commitment. We do want it basically turned into a legally binding document, so a memorandum of understanding, and you know, I think that's. We will pursue any means possible to basically have a memorandum of understanding that captures that sentiment that we were guaranteed by the former president of Treasury Board.
Mm-hmm. And do we know what the proposed sick leave benefit will look like
As I understand it, I think it's still in discussion. Like I think various things. One thing about bargaining is that often there's a lot of back and forth. So we and I was not part of the bargaining table, so I can't give you kind of insider information. But there's often a back and forth. I think it might take various forms. You know, and I don't want to say things that might, you know, throw people off. I think we would just want something that guarantees that members have an appropriate amount of sick leave and also don't have to start at zero, you know, as if they just started in the public service. But I can't say that I think my gut tells me that Treasury Board will want us to quantify it in some way. You know, I think that just stands to reason. But again, I don't want to speculate too much on that because I wasn't part of those direct discussions. And I think in the end, it's just coming to some sort of agreement on what exactly it'll be, given the fact that, you know, you folks had a basically unlimited sick leave plan, and we have to come to some sort of agreement on what's the most beneficial for members and what's the fairest.
Yeah, and this one may be something that we can't address either, but I'll pose it because it's here. This person has been told that the current PSAC USJE members will have seniority over the civilian members. Is that something that would be addressed at the bargaining table?
I'm assuming so. I'm not sure what type of seniority rights we're talking about. Like there's certain seniority provisions contained in the collective agreement, and I'm sure, you know, again, I think it would stand to reason that we would have some sort of agreement with Treasury Board as to what's fair. Seniority sometimes, you know, does get discussed. Last round, for example, there was an amendment to the collective agreement, and I don't remember all the specific details, but it had to do with former members of the Canadian Forces and having their former service in the forces recognized as seniority in the public service, and we came to an understanding with the employer with regards to that. So. You know, again, this might be a bit speculative, but let's say if ever members fell, if ever that's the way it fell, let's say that, you know, current members got more seniority than CM members that were deemed in, and CM members, and again, this is purely speculative, so I don't want you to think that this is what's gonna happen, because like I said, perhaps seniority was raised as part of discussions. But let's say you did fall under seniority, I think it would stand to be raised in subsequent rounds of bargaining, where CM members would say, you know, please make the collective agreement clear that our former service as CM members outside of the public service is recognized, as has been done for the Canadian Forces. And I think that's the kind of thing, like I said, it can be presented to us as a bargaining input and could be brought to subsequent rounds. But for all we know, I like, again, I think that could be speculative. If that's what PIPS agreed to, it's possible. But if we don't come to an agreement now in the deeming process, I think this aspect of seniority could be raised very quickly in a subsequent round at Treasury Board.
Great. So I'll take the next one, and you can have a sip of water. So the question is, how can someone that works in the same team end up in a different union? And so it's the way that the bargaining agents are set up is by classification. So that person working in the same team with you would be in a different classification, ergo they ended up in a different union. In the public service, there are 17 unions, and even within PSAC, some of our members might work in the same proximity as another PSAC member, but they're in a different component, for example. So it's more based on classifications, division of work, departments, etc. So it's not a cut and dry thing, but that would be the reason why. Let's see what's next here. If there's a potential strike looming, would the CMs be expected to cross the picket line or not cross the picket line?
I think I might ask maybe Stan, have you, I'm assuming you've discussed this with members already?
Yes, so we have completed the essential service agreements, not signed off by PSAC yet, I don't believe, with the RCMP for the current public servants. Now, if the deeming is delayed, of course, it won't be a factor. But if the deeming goes through, then we have I have already asked RCMP about negotiating essential service agreements with the civilian members. And so what those are is the employer, along with us through negotiations and consultation, determine what positions would be essential. In other words, if there is a strike, these folks would have to go to work. And so there's 3 levels. There is a level 1, which is you're fully essential, you must go to work. There's a level 2, which is more of a replacement level. So if somebody that is deemed essential at a level 1, but all of a sudden has to take long-term leave or something, then somebody that was a level 2 would come in, or even sometimes it'll be if a level 1 person is sick for 1 day, they might ask for one of the level 2 people to come in and work that day. And then you have level 3, which is emergencies. And then if there's an emergency, then anybody deemed a level 3 would go in. But we are very reasonable. For example, when 9/11 happened, we were on full strike. Many of our sites had strike lines up, picket lines at Edmonton Institution, the maximum security where I worked. We had a picket line. When we heard what happened, we immediately shut the picket line down and everybody went into work because we didn't know what was going to happen. So it's not like we're going to stop, particularly with members within the USJE that have such critical jobs to public safety, that we're going to say, no, if something happens, we're not going out. So a little more to the question, are you expected not to cross the picket line? Well, yes, we would expect you to honor the picket line if you are not deemed essential, and you will get a letter and you would show that to the picket line captain. We certainly do. PSAC does pay strike pay, so if you're out on strike with us and you haven't been deemed essential, you would receive strike pay. And also many local USJE locals have quite substantial strike accounts, and so they would top up the PSAC amount that would be given to ensure that all the members that are on that line at a local would be taking home at least as much, if not a little bit more, but all the money is tax free. So they would be better off, quite frankly, financially, by receiving strike pay and being out on the line. Thank you.
Thanks. So here's another one. I recently discovered that a term and condition for civilians was changed. And I understood that's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be frozen. If it's a matter of normal business, normal course of business, that change, like it would have happened annually, for example, that's considered acceptable. But if it's something relatively new or brand new that has never happened before, that's something we could explore. So you could send that information to the email address here on the screen, and we can investigate that further. We need a little bit more detail. Let's see here. What if someone is doing sort of a hybrid position and that part of that position went to PIP's bargaining agent and the other part of that position is supposed to go to PSAC? How would that be resolved?
I'm not sure if that's a Omar question or a Stan question.
I was wondering the same thing.
I'll take it on. I'll take it on. The employer is going to have to decide what substantive position that individual will be in, and they'll have to be assigned to the appropriate bargaining agent. There's not a splitting of work that way, even if functionally that's how it's worked. There'll have to be a decision made at some point. Let's see here. Someone works in the forensic lab as a technologist in Surrey. Promotional structure has been lost with the upcoming deeming. Our specialists are classified in PIPs, and as a result, when those technologists get promoted, pay is no longer protected. I know this is an issue that's been brought up and is being explored. I think Gail, your negotiator, has been speaking with the employer about this particular issue. I don't know, Omar, if you have any more information on, or Stan, on the issues of the lab technologists at this point, or if it's something that we're just working on.
I personally have not heard details of that, but it's good to know that Gail is familiar with that situation. So hopefully we'll find a way to address it appropriately in the short or medium term.
Yes, and I haven't heard anything further other than Gail was trying to address it with the employer.
Okay, great. And we're just coming into our last couple of minutes here. We do have a few more questions. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get through them all, but we'll certainly add them to the Q&A section that's on the USJE website, identified here. So the next question is, why are we not discussing grandparenting? So that'd be a negotiations question.
Yeah, so we are in fact discussing that. I mean, that is a big part of it. You know, grandparenting could very well be how the understanding that we come to with the employer. You know, I think whenever there's an opportunity, we want to maintain working conditions for all members, subsequent members who are hired. But we understand that, you know, that could be a compromise that we come to with the employer, that essentially that current members have all their working conditions grandparented. If the employer is willing to accept that, I think, you know, this ideal is that you have good working conditions and everyone who comes in after you has the exact same good working conditions. But if there's some sort of you know, resolution we can get to that involves grandparenting, it's been done before, and I think that we just have to make sure that we figure out the you know, the ramifications of that in the long term. And you know, I think essentially that's what the Bryson letter was about, and that's kind of what we've made clear to Treasury Board, is that we wanted to make sure that no one, you know, upon deeming had their working conditions, you know, truncated or reduced. You know, so grandparenting is definitely a mechanism through which we can accomplish that. Yeah.
So this last question is a positive one to segue into the next stages of your transition into the public service and part of our union and component. When can we expect a USJE member to attend and get the CMs to sign union cards? So I think this work will be ongoing, developing your relationship with your locals, your regional vice presidents, your local executive and presidents and representatives. But Stan, maybe you want to speak to that a little bit more, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so I think if deeming is announced, you will start seeing the local representatives come around with membership cards to sign. But I do want you to be aware that just because you sign a membership card, because you're new, you're not going to be paying union dues until we have a collective agreement for you. So you have an advantage in that you sign the union card, you give us the information, you have representation, but for the time being, you're not having to pay any union dues. So likely shortly after deeming is announced, then you'll start seeing your local representatives come around with cards to sign.
Yeah, and I would add, make sure that you stay plugged into the USJE website and PSAC's website as well. You know, we have 23 regional offices of PSAC right across the country. So check out the PSACunion.ca website for more information about that, because there's also support for you through the PSAC regional offices as well as your component. So that's all the time we have for tonight. As I said, the questions that we didn't get to answer tonight, we'll make sure that we include them in our Q&A listing on USJE's website, the CM page. Thanks both Omar and Stan for providing the content tonight, and thanks all of you for taking the time to engage with your union. We hope to do more of this in the future to continue to keep you plugged in. We know this is a challenging process you're going through on all fronts, so we want to be as supportive as we can and provide you with as much information as we can. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.